Hi, I'm Paige. Welcome back to my kitchen. You're watching the next episode of Doughing It with Paigey. I apologize, it's been a minute since I have put out a video, but I've been working on my sourdough starter and I've been trying to make sure that he is top-notch for you guys. Today we're going to be going over the sourdough starter recipe from the cookbook Bread Baking for Beginners by Bonnie Ohara. The sourdough starter is fermented dough that over time creates its own natural wild yeast through the process of fermentation. So what's really cool about sourdough starters is that they're actually alive, and the flour that you're going to be feeding them each day is their food. If you've been watching this series so far, you know that we've been using instant yeast in every recipe in this book so far. This sourdough starter is going to help us through the last 3 recipes in this book, and the sourdough starter eliminates the need for using instant yeast altogether. So the sourdough starter recipe in this book is really great for beginners because it is a 100% hydration starter. Now all that means is it's a simple 1-to-1 ratio, so you'll be using equal parts flour, equal parts water. A couple of things about sourdough starters. First of all, they are a little bit high maintenance. Now on top of having to feed them every day, you're also going to want to use a little bit higher quality flour. Personally, in all of the other recipes in this book, I usually use store brand or off-brand flour, and I never have an issue. But with my sourdough starters and with my sourdough breads, I'd like to splurge a little bit, spend a few extra dollars, and get a higher quality flour. I have been using unbleached all-purpose King Arthur flour, and for the whole wheat flour, I am using gold medal quality whole wheat. As far as the water that you're giving your sourdough, you don't want to use water directly from the tap either. You're going to want to use filtered water. Luckily, me and my family drink bottled water all the time, so I usually always have filtered water on hand. Another thing about them being high maintenance, I did mention you have to feed them every day. I usually feed my sourdough starter anywhere between 24 and 26 hours. I have gone a little bit over 26 hours and I've never had an issue with that. I've also fed it a little bit before the 24-hour mark and I've never had a problem with that either. I usually just try to be very consistent with my feedings and feed them right around that 24-hour mark. You're also going to need a place for your sourdough starter to live. I recommend using a clear jar just so you can kind of monitor the level. It'll start to rise and fall, and I like to keep track of that personally. So if you have a clear jar around, I would recommend using that. I have seen people use bowls as well, so if you want to use a bowl, feel free to do that. You will need a lid or something loosely covering the top of your bowl if you decide to go that route. This is what I've been keeping my sourdough starter in. It's not a mason jar. I actually got this at Hobby Lobby. I think after tax and the 50% off sale, I spent about $3 on this, so it's been a really good home for my starter. So as I mentioned, your sourdough starter is going to take about a week to make. I'm going to be showing you guys how to make your sourdough starter, and I'm also going to be showing my daily feedings as well as what my sourdough starter looks like in the first few days of making it. Hopefully that'll be a little bit helpful for you guys if you've never tried making a sourdough starter, and you can see the activity that I was getting from mine, so it can be a helpful guide for you guys if you don't know what to expect. I was also able to get a short time lapse of my sourdough starter once I really started seeing peak activation and a lot of activity from him. I'll show you guys what that looks like in just a bit. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you guys how to make your sourdough starter. To start, you should weigh your jar without the lid and write down how much it weighs so you can keep track of how much starter is in your jar. To start out making our sourdough starter, we're going to use 50 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour, and we're going to use 50 grams of whole wheat flour. I'm going to be adding 100 grams of filtered water, and I want to make sure that that's between 80 and 90 degrees, so just make sure that you take the temperature of your water. I'm going to pour all these into my jar and give it a good stir. As you can see here, I'm using a chopstick. I like to use a chopstick because it's easy for me to get around the edges, and I just want to make sure that all the dry ingredients are well incorporated with the water until this looks almost like a dough. I'm going to cover this up really loosely with the lid for the jar. It'll be ready for its first feeding when we see bubbles on the surface. So we'll come back and check this in about 24 hours. Alright, it's been about 24 hours. As you can see, I've got about 6 to 8 large bubbles on the surface of my sourdough starter. So I'm going to take that as a good sign, and I'm going to go ahead and feed him for the very first time. I'm gonna start by removing half of the starter. I usually place a fold top bag right on my scale and weigh out half of the starter. If you ever need to know how much starter is in your jar, just weigh out your jar, subtract the weight of the empty jar, and then cut that amount in half. That's how much starter you'll need to discard. I used a spoon for the first few days to remove my starter. I was trying to keep the sides of my jar clean for y'all, but if you want to pour your starter right out of the jar, you can obviously do that too. When my discard is out, I'm just going to toss that in the trash, and I'm going to weigh out the exact same measurements as last time. So I'm going to do that 50 grams unbleached all-purpose, 50 grams whole wheat flour, and 100 grams of filtered water. I'm going to add all of this into the jar, give it a good mix, and this will be my starter's first feeding. So I'm going to cover him up loosely with a lid. We'll come back and check him in another 24 hours. All right, it's day 3. It's time for my second feeding. So as you can see, I have got a lot of bubbles on the surface today of all different sizes. It's got a little bit of a sour smell today, a little bit more sour than it was yesterday. Not anything too overpowering, but we're gonna go ahead and discard half of this. So again, fold top bag on my scale. I'm spooning out half of my starter, and I'm just gonna toss this into the trash. Again, same thing, I'm just gonna feed my sourdough starter just like I did the day before. So 50 grams unbleached all-purpose, 50 grams whole wheat flour, and 100 grams of water. Now again, make sure that you're keeping that water temperature right between 80 and 90 degrees. I'm gonna give it a nice good stir. I'm gonna place a little piece of tape on my sourdough starter jar with the bottom line of the tape lining up with the top of my starter. That way we can keep track and see if it's growing at all overnight. I'm gonna cover it up loosely with a lid, and we'll come back and check it tomorrow. All right, it is day 4. It's time for the third feed. As you can see, I've got a lot of bubbles here on the surface, and I'm gonna show you guys the side here. As you can see, it didn't really have any growth overnight. No big deal. I'm gonna discard and feed him as I normally would. And you're just gonna continue doing this method until you start to get some rise out of your sourdough starter. Again, that usually happens in about 7 days, but for me, it took 16 days. So I'm gonna fast forward to the 16-day mark so you guys can see what it's gonna look like. So as you can see, I've got tons of bubbles. It's really airy and light. I'll show the side here. You can see that it's really risen from that bottom tape line. Now I'm gonna show you guys a time lapse of what happens to my sourdough starter within the first hour after I fed him. He rose about halfway up the tape line just within the first hour. By the next day, he had completely risen past the tape line, and that is the kind of activity that you're looking for with your sourdough starter. I'm gonna show you what peak activation looks like with your sourdough starter. I'm gonna spoon out a little bit of starter here, and I'm going to drop it in a glass of warm water. If it floats, that means it is fully activated. If you're about to make bread, this is the best time to use your sourdough starter, about 12 hours after you feed it. All right, guys, here's my starter. His name is Freddie Murphy. He is a little over a month old now. I really wanted a very mature starter for the sourdough recipes that we're gonna be doing in the coming weeks, and let me tell you, he is sour. Here's what my starter looks like now. As you can see, he's got tons and tons of bubbles on the surface. He's got a pretty sour smell. It's been about 18 hours since I've fed him. I'll probably feed him sometime within the next 6 hours or so. Now, for your discard, you don't necessarily have to start throwing your discard into the trash if you don't want to get rid of it. After it's past that 7-day mark and it's healthy and active, feel free to hand off your discard to a friend if they're looking to start a sourdough starter on their own. You can also make other recipes that aren't bread with your sourdough discard. I've seen people make pancakes, waffles, chocolate chip cookies, even fried chicken. So I'll leave a couple of links to some recipes down in the description below. Now the book does provide a few troubleshooting steps for you guys if you're running into some weird issues with your sourdough starter. One thing I will mention is if you're getting a layer of alcohol or a brownish kind of juice on the top of your sourdough starter, A lot of people will say that you need to bump up your feedings and start feeding your sourdough starter more than once a day. I think in the book the author recommends that you totally toss out the sourdough starter. I've never had any experiences with hooch or a layer of alcohol on the top of my sourdough starter, so I can't give you guys tons of advice on that. I would definitely try bumping up your feedings to maybe 2 times a day before I would totally throw out your sourdough starter, but that's just me. Now the smell of your sourdough starter should be something along the lines of a fruity, yeasty smell. Now, like I said, my sourdough starter is very, very sour. When he is hungry, sometimes I'll take off the lid and give it a good whiff, and it will make my eyes water. That's how sour it is. Something to keep in mind, if it starts to smell like vinegar or acetone or sometimes like a really cheap red wine, it means that he is super hungry and really, really tired from trying to feed on any leftover food in the jar. So that means it's getting pretty close to feeding time. So that's usually when I would try to jump in and feed him. Otherwise, I mentioned a minute ago that my sourdough starter, it's been about 18 hours since I fed him. Right now he smells fruity, yeasty, sour, but not anything like alcohol or anything like that. Now another thing I want to mention is the temperature of your water. I know we went over the water temperature you need to have when you're making your sourdough starter a minute ago, but I will say when I first started making this particular sourdough starter, I was using room temperature water for the first week or so, and it just wasn't hot enough. You really want to try to get your water between 80 and 90 degrees in order to get peak activation out of your sourdough. So take out your kitchen thermometer, take the temperature of your water. You don't want any extreme temperatures. I would say nothing over 95 degrees. You definitely don't want to kill your starter, and you don't want anything too cold because you're just not going to get any activity out of it, and that is personally based on my experience with this starter. Too cold of water, it's never going to rise or fall. It's just going to get bubbles on the top of the surface and just kind of stay flat. I hope that makes sense. Last thing I want to mention is refrigerating your sourdough starter. I've never done it. A lot of people online do it, especially if they have to leave for weeks at a time, perhaps on a vacation or something like that. They're just not able to feed their sourdough. I know a lot of people will just put it in the fridge and come back and just continue feeding and discarding as they would in the past. Again, I have never tried that, but I've heard great things. If you have to leave your sourdough starter, I would probably take mine with me, but you could easily put it in the fridge and do a little bit of research on that. I hope this video helped you guys. Just to recap, here are the most important things about your sourdough starter. First off, consistent feedings. Be consistent with the timing that you're feeding your sourdough starter if you want to keep him alive. Number 2, keep your water temperature between 80 and 90 degrees. Number 3, use good quality flours and filtered water. And number 4, be patient. It's a lot harder to kill a sourdough starter than you might think it is. Just be patient and be consistent, and just remember that it took me about a month to get Freddie Murphy up and running. It may have taken me a little bit longer than I wanted to get him started, but now I have a very mature and healthy starter and he's doing just fine. Like I said, it took me about a month, but now I have a very healthy starter that's gonna make some really, really great sourdough bread. So just be patient and don't be so hard on yourself. If you guys have any questions about the sourdough process and making your sourdough starter, please feel free to leave me a question in the comments below, and I will do my very best to answer you guys as honestly as I can. Now be sure to tune in next week because we are going to be making the very first sourdough recipe in this book, which is the beginner sourdough, and I am so excited to try that out with you guys. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, be sure to subscribe, and thanks again for watching Doing It with Paigey. I'll see you guys next time.